right? So Pharrell Williams is, of course, an incredibly famous and successful singer, songwriter, and music executive. This is not somebody who has led a radically difficult life in the United States. Like, by all indicators, he's led a pretty great life in the United States. This person is probably worth hundreds of millions of dollars at a minimum. This is a person who was born in Virginia Beach, Virginia, and he has a couple of brothers. His mom was a teacher. His dad was a handyman. He went to 7th grade summer band camp, and then he ended up at Northwestern University for a couple of years. This does not sound like the story of wild unsuccess that supposedly America is fostering. It does not sound like the story of discrimination and evil that America is fostering. But according to Pharrell Williams says that July 4th is really, really bad. And this is a very bizarre view of July 4th, because as we will see, the great Black liberators in American history, particularly people like Frederick Douglass, understood that July 4th originally did not apply to slaves. Right? He gave a very, very famous oration, a very hard-nosed and edgy oration, did Frederick Douglass, before slavery was abolished, in which he talked about the fact that July 4th was not applied to Black Americans. The Black Americans looked at July 4th and they said, it's not our holiday. We're still in slavery. It liberated you, but it didn't liberate us. But he said, the point is that July 4th is the ideal to which you guys need to be held. July 4th is the standard that you will be held to. Martin Luther King Jr. said the same thing. But the new brand of Black leadership is to suggest that July 4th is inherently evil, that the end of slavery, the end of Jim Crow, none of that means anything. And so July 4th itself needs to be canceled, because basically America needs to be canceled. It is not that America was built on high ideals that people failed to live up to. It's that America's ideals were the founding creed of racism, sexism, bigotry, and homophobia. The systems themselves created racism, right? This is a case that Ibram Kendi actually makes explicitly, right? That the systems themselves created racism. Racism was not even the progenitor of the systems. The systems created racism. And then those systems are still in place today, and therefore nothing has changed. And therefore the systems need to be ripped down. And so you can have people like Pharrell Williams, who are incredibly successful within the system, who are fighting the system because the system itself is the racism. The system doesn't have to be shown to be racist. The system doesn't, you don't have to look at the system and say, here's a racist thing about the system. Instead, all you have to do, even if you're Pharrell Williams and you're a very, very wealthy Black man in America who's led an incredibly successful and blessed life in the United States, you can still look at the group inequality data and say this system is unfair and bad, and therefore July 4th has to go. Pharrell Williams does this interview on CNBC, and he criticizes Independence Day, and then he advocates for reparations. He also suggests that we take off Juneteenth as a paid holiday, which, by the way, I don't have really a problem with. Like, Juneteenth seems like that should be a day of American celebration. That is the day on which the Emancipation Proclamation was finally read to the freed slaves of Texas, which was the last state to read the Emancipation Proclamation. It happened June 19th, 1865. So that is a day well worth celebrating. And by the way, the reason it's worth celebrating is because it marked an actual shift in American history, a shift that so many of the folks of the woke left refuse to acknowledge, because slavery, according to the woke left, merely went underground, right? Slavery never really ended. It just became, according to Anna DuVernay, a system of prison industrial complexes. It simply became, according to Robin DiAngelo, the soft bigotry of the regular corporate world and all of this sort of nonsense. The reason we should celebrate Juneteenth is because it was, in fact, a sea change, and it was a living up to ideals. So here is Pharrell Williams ignoring all of that and suggesting instead that Independence Day is really bad, and therefore it shouldn't really be it's not really a national holiday for everyone.
When July 4th, 1776 took place, the only ones that were free from the British monarchy were our white brothers. When you think about June 19th, that marks a 2-year period where we were supposed to be freed, but we hadn't been still. We feel like the day that we were freed, everyone was free. So why not make that a paid holiday? We deserve that. There's a word that scares so many people. It's called reparations. And we deserve that too.
Okay, I don't understand how Pharrell Williams, who's worth $200 million, deserves reparations from a white Appalachian guy who's worth $20,000 or zero. That doesn't make any sense to me. Now, to be fair to Pharrell Williams, he's suggesting, again, Juneteenth in addition to July 4th. Okay, and that again, I don't actually have a problem with. But the criticism of July 4th ceased to apply when Juneteenth happened. Okay, the criticism of July 4th became irrelevant by the terms of the deal. What I mean by that is that July 4th was an aspirational holiday about American freedom. And Frederick Douglass criticized July 4th in really strong language, right? Because he said that you're not living up to your own founding creed. But July 4th is a day of celebration for everyone. The suggestion by Pharrell Williams that it's not a celebration for everyone today is obviously very silly. It is a day of celebration for everyone, because it does represent the key point in the liberation of all Americans. It just took far longer because of cruelty and evil for Black Americans to gain the freedoms that should have been promised to them on July 4th. Here's what Frederick Douglass, who has a lot more, it seems to me that Frederick Douglass had a lot more to say about the problems of racism and bigotry and cruelty of racism than anybody who is alive today. I mean, Frederick Douglass actually lived as a slave, right? Here's Frederick Douglass talking about this. He gave a very famous oration on this, and it's a beautiful, beautiful piece of both writing and oratory. Very famous. It's one of the reasons why I've suggested that Frederick Douglass is a second founding father who should be put on the American currency, because he, along with Abraham Lincoln, really understood that the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States were ideals to aspire to, and America was not living up to those ideals, and they had to be brought into balance, right? They had to be brought into rectification, because according to a lot of people, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution were in opposition to one another. In fact, John C. Calhoun, who was one of the leaders of the sort of pre-Confederacy Confederacy, right? He died before the actual Civil War, but he was an ardent pro-slavery advocate. He suggested that the Declaration of Independence was bad, that the only thing that mattered was the Constitution. Whereas Abraham Lincoln suggested that the Declaration of Independence is what he called the apple of gold and the Constitution the frame of silver. What he meant by that is the ideals of the Declaration of Independence were protected by the Constitution. So if you read the Constitution without the Declaration, then you would miss the high ideals, which are the reasons that the Constitution was brought about in the first place. And again, slaveholders said, okay, well, the Declaration doesn't matter. That was just kind of something we said at the time. It was something that we just put out. There's a piece of propaganda. The only thing that matters is the hard terms of the Constitution. The reason the Declaration of Independence matters, and that's what we're celebrating on July 4th, right? That's not Constitution Day. That's July 4th. The reason we celebrate the Declaration of Independence is because the philosophy of the United States is embedded in the Declaration of Independence. Really three separate propositions. First, the reality of natural rights, pre-existing government, inalienable and precious, and endemic to all human beings. Right? Natural rights that exist for you, no matter where you are, right? Not equally realized for everybody at all times, but those natural rights pre-exist government. Second, the equality of all human beings before the law and in their rights. All men are created equal, right? That doesn't mean all men are created with equal capacity or equal ability. It means that all men are to be treated the same by the law because you are equal in your rights, those rights that pre-exist government. And finally, the belief that government exists to protect natural rights and to enforce that equality before the law. That's the role of government. That's what the Declaration of Independence is about. American philosophy believes that these propositions are self-evident, right? And then the founders attempted to effectuate that philosophy in the Constitution of the United States. And that's what Frederick Douglass recognized in a way that so many of today's modern race thinkers refuse to recognize. Frederick Douglass said, look, the obstacle here is racism. The obstacle is old-fashioned, brutal bigotry. The obstacle here is slavery and Jim Crow and institutions of discrimination. You remove those, and what you are left with is, again, that gold apple in the silver frame. But according to so many thinkers today, that's not really the problem. There was no gold apple. The gold apple was always worm-ridden, and the silver frame was always made of dross. Right? That's the actual argument here, is whether the Declaration and the Constitution are inherently good or whether the Declaration and Constitution are inherently corrupt and evil. Frederick Douglass said they're inherently good. We're not living up to them. Here's what Frederick Douglass, a freed slave, who, let me tell you, has suffered a hell of a lot more than Pharrell Williams ever has in his life. And that is not a close comparison. By the way, fair to say, Frederick Douglass suffered a hell of a lot more than virtually every person living in America. The man lived as a slave. Here's what he says. The signers of the Declaration of Independence were brave men. They were great men, too, great enough to give fame to a great age. They believed in order, but not in the order of tyranny. With them, nothing was settled that was not right. With them, justice, liberty, and humanity were final, not slavery and oppression. What he's saying is that the principles they established would allow for the extirpation of slavery and oppression. And the question he asked, this was his big question in his July 4th peroration. He said, are the great principles of political freedom and of natural justice embodied in that Declaration of Independence extended to us? Right? The entire thing is, I'm not ripping on the Declaration. I'm not ripping on the Constitution. I'm not even ripping on the founders. What I am saying is what Frederick Douglass says is those, when these words were written, they were not true for us. But we need to make them true for us because they are great principles of political freedom and of natural justice. What exactly are those great principles? So Calvin Coolidge, probably the most underrated president in American history. Calvin Coolidge was a very good president. He gave the 150th anniversary speech in 1926 about the Declaration of Independence. And here is how he described the philosophy of the Declaration of Independence. He said, if all men are created equal, that is final. If they are endowed with inalienable rights, that is final. If governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, that is final. No advance, no progress can be made beyond these propositions. If anyone wishes to deny their truth or their soundness, the only direction in which he can proceed historically is not forward, but backward, toward the time when there was no equality, no rights of the individual, no rule of the people. We live in an age of science and of abounding accumulation of material things. These did not create our declaration. Our declaration created them. That's what we're celebrating on July 4th. And that's something that all Americans should be celebrating this weekend as we approach July 4th. But unfortunately, there is a case afoot to not celebrate those things. Because in the view, again, of so many of the disintegrationists, as I describe in my upcoming book, How to Destroy America in 3 Easy Steps. In the book, I describe people who want to disintegrate the Union as disintegrationists. It's not right versus left. It's disintegrationists versus unionists. People who would like to see the country held together on the basis of fundamental principles, and people who would like to see the country fall apart. The basic idea that those principles are themselves rooted in sexism and bigotry and racism and have promulgated sexism, bigotry, racism, inequality. That's a battle for the heart and soul of the country. That is a battle for the entire mind and future of the country. And it's a battle whether we are going to go forward or whether we're going to go backward, because Coolidge was exactly right. Progress, what made America unique, what makes America powerful, what makes America good, are the original founding principles that we have so often failed to live up to, but that we have always striven to move toward as a country. Not everybody in the country, but the country as a whole. And that we've tried to move toward that, stumbling, falling, but overall moving toward that progress. And if you move away from those fundamental principles, and that's what we're talking about right now, destruction of those fundamental principles, right, that all men are created equal and endowed with inalienable rights, and that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. As we move away from that, we move toward regression, not progression. We move toward either mob rule or autocracy, right? That is what we move toward. Not freedom, not liberty, not prosperity. All those things become a figment of the imagination. And and by the way, the disintegrationists are fighting all of these principles right now. The notion that all men are created equal is something that is denied. It is fundamentally denied by the white fragility, anti-racism outlook of Ibram Kendi and of Robin DiAngelo. Because again, you can judge someone and their complicity in the system simply on the basis of their race. That denies. It doesn't actually acknowledge that all men are created equal in their rights. What they do is they play a little word game. They say what we mean by all men are created equal is that if all men are truly created equal, and this is basically what Ibram Kendi says, if all men are truly created equal, they should all have equal outcomes. That's not what all men are created equal means. All men are created equal means they were created with rights, that they were created equal before the law. It doesn't mean that Colton and I both have the same jump shot. It doesn't mean that I'm going to play in the NBA or be a WWE wrestler, or that somebody else is capable of hosting a successful podcast. We all have different abilities. That's called being a human being. What it does mean is that in the eyes of God and in the eyes of the law, we are all equal. The notion that we're endowed with inalienable rights, the left doesn't believe in inalienable rights. The left believes, like the French Revolution believed, that rights can be put aside in favor of the common good, right? That the idea is the common good can overreach those rights. And so this is why you are seeing right now an attack particularly on freedom of speech, which we'll get to in just one second. The idea that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, that too is overridden. Instead, the left would love to see mob rule, because what we're seeing right now has nothing to do with the consent of the governed. Is Chaz about the consent of the governed? And the left is rooting for it. Is pure majoritarianism the consent of the governed? Because who consents to be governed by a pure 51% majority? Nobody, right? Your inalienable rights cannot be alienated by a simple majority vote. The founders understood this, but all of these things are being disintegrated in the name of a new utopia. And that's really terrible. July 4th has to stand because July 4th is really, really important. Instead, we seem to be moving away from the principles of July 4th by grouping people together in races, by moving away from the principles of Juneteenth, by the way, by moving away from the principles of Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln, and yes, the principles of the Declaration and the Constitution. And that's a disaster for the country. This video is sponsored by Blinksale. It is the revolutionary invoicing software for small businesses. Spend less time billing, more time making the money with Blinksale. Go down to the link in our description and give it a click.